Hotep, I'm Dr. Gloria Lattimore Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the H3O Art of Life show. The title of this show is Who Are You Calling a Slave? The Nicknaming of Humanity. That's a deliberately chosen title, and I meant to pair it up with Queen Latifah's song, Who You Calling a Bee? Because we ought to recoil at the sound of that name in the same way that we do with the sound of the N word. In fact, we ought to consider that another N word, another way of denigrating our people and making us feel as though we are inferior. We are not inferior to anyone, have never been, and will never will be. So it's very important that I have the guests that I have in this studio. Hunter Havelin Adams III, whose upcoming book, We Were Never Slaves, is going to start a conversation and perhaps a controversy around the use of this term as applies to African captives who were forcibly removed from their land and put into bondage under might and sword and guns and all other kinds of forces. It's very important that we ask, who you calling a slave?
Yes, that's very powerful. And so we're going to have the context for this conversation today. And thank you very much, Dr. Peace, for inviting me on. Chicago started a tradition a long time ago of having these awesome jazz festivals around Labor Day weekend, and some of the greatest names in creative music, so-called jazz, have performed at the Petrillo Bandshell and now Millennium Park. And so many cities have taken on the same tradition and hold their jazz festivals around the same time as Chicago. There's Detroit, in particular, what we're going to focus on today is the Montreal Jazz Festival, and they all are free. Now, the Montreal Jazz Festival is probably the largest, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, at least in North America, jazz festival there is. But the Montreal Jazz Festival is more of an eclectic festival that features more than just contemporary, purist, creative, avant-garde, traditional New Orleans jazz. So they, over the years, have expanded their repertoire, mainly, to expose people to other musics besides jazz, even though it's called the Montreal Jazz Festival. So you may hear some R&B or some rock or some folk or so forth. Plus, they also have special theatrical performances at their jazz festival. And so one performance that they had this year, just last month, was a commissioned work called Slave. And the director was a well-known singer, a very good singer. Her name is Beatrice Betty Bonifaci. And she wrote this theatrical odyssey, as she calls it, to share the experiences of slave songs, quote, slave songs, African American slave songs, and the experience of, quote, being in bondage. Sounds good. Sounds like that might be an interesting production. The problem is the question that has come up, was it cultural appropriation? Because Miss Boniface is of Serbian heritage, and the production is featuring songs primarily from the African American experience of plantation life. You know, so there's kind of a disconnect there, Dr. Peace.
Entirely a
Right.
disconnect.
That, but to her credit, one of the things that she allegedly does was she wants to trace the origin of the term back to Slavic people from which her heritage, which that's what she represents. She represents Slavic, Eastern European heritage. And I think if she's going to do a play, well, then it should be about that. But we would have liked to have heard some Slavic songs of suffering under bondage from the Ottoman Empire, you know, since they were outside of the Roman Empire.
It would have been appropriate to hear
Right.
the songs of the
think.
people whose history she's describing.
But what she did, which so many people found offensive, was that she had 8 performers, 2 black women, and the women, and we'll see some images courtesy of the Montreal Gazette, the performers were picking cotton.
Oh, does cotton
I
grow in
mean-
Serbia?
I don't know really.
Do black people grow in Serbia?
I don't think there's too many African people, African descended people in Serbia. There's probably never were. How do you have to present a theatrical odyssey, as she calls it, of white women with bushels of cotton singing songs of our ancestors? It's just incongruent. It doesn't make sense. But she, because she's well known, and the director of the show, what's his name? I can't think of it. Is
You've got some people on stage.
right? Yeah. Here's a scene from. I have to laugh. It's not funny, but
It's
if somebody
ludicrous.
tried to do this performance at the Harris Theater in Chicago, it would have never been produced.
It would have been a picket line in front of the Harris Theater.
Well, there were picket lines, and the show was canceled after 2 shows because the black community in Montreal and others, they weren't having it and shut the thing down. And it's ironic that after the first 2 shows, it sold out 16 shows. 8,000 tickets were sold to see this odyssey, this travesty.
That's travesty is a better word.
How can you stage such a production like this and feel that it's okay? Well, they're just songs and we're singing them. But
Well,
if you're going to have the characters dress up, white women weren't in the fields picking cotton. White women were not picking sugar cane. That's false. That's a lie.
And they were not singing
They didn't sing those songs.
The authentic,
They
original,
weren't their
genuine
songs.
music of our ancestors were not the songs
But she
they
said
would have been
she
singing.
wanted to draw attention to human trafficking and the prison industrial complex. Okay, but my issue with this production, and
Was
I
it-
haven't seen, I've seen some clips of it.
The commingling of history. That
It's-
you are commingling events that never could have taken place, and you're using authentic music to underscore a fraud, actually.
It is fraudulent. It is fraudulent. You know, she should have had all white characters and put them in blackface. Then it would have been
Been a
more like
minstrel
Gone in
show.
the Wind. That would have been more acceptable. I mean, if you're going to be in your face with this. And what's wrong with these black women want to get paid to be in this production of humiliation and degradation? I just don't understand that.
Well, let's go to this SLAV without the E that's originated this reprehensible term that has been applied to black people as though that is our heritage.
What's interesting about that term was in 2010, I had distinct honor of being invited by the Council General of the Czech Republic, now called Czechia, to come to the 20-year commemoration of the Velvet Revolution. That was the revolution that brought down at last the influence of the Soviet, the old Russian world in Eastern Europe. And the outcome of that was their president, Václav Havel, was a poet, philosopher, playwright, who came president around the same time President Barack Obama did. Anyway, I asked him about the origin of the word slave, and he said, we don't talk about that. You know, he was very, very annoyed with that. He said, but I tell you what, I'm going to invite you to come to this 20-year commemoration, and there'll be someone there, a professor from Northwestern, the dean of the graduate school at the time. His name was Dr. Wachtel, and he'll be able to tell you. So I get my invitation. I go down to the Czech consulate. It was a wonderful event. There was movies being shown and people reciting poems by famous Czech poets, which I've never heard before. And then the professor spoke, and I went up and asked him the same question. And he said, we don't talk about that. He turned his back on me and stormed away from me. And so I really was very disappointed because I came all the way down here at the invitation of the Council General, expecting to get an answer to my question, and was dissed. But then an amazing thing happened. There was a man standing next to me, eavesdropping in on our conversation. And he said, that's my dad, and you upset him. I said, upset him? I just asked him what I thought was a simple question. He said, it brought up memories of the darkness. I said, the darkness? What was that? He said, well, sir, come and join me for a traditional Czech dinner, Czech beer, the best Czech beer, and conversation, and I will break it all down to you. And so I go into the conference room, a huge conference room, and he spent an hour and a half breaking down to me the history of the Slavic experience, which was absolutely incredible because it has nothing at all to do with bondage as we understand it. Nothing at all. We've been hoodwinked and bamboozled and led astray, as our great prophet, Minister Malcolm X, has said, Dr. Peace. And the thing about it is, you know, he was telling me how languages evolve over time. Well, we know that. You know, one of the best linguists, Dr. Joseph Ben Levy, you know, reads and speaks, 15 different languages. You know, he talks about that. And so the thing, this is so fantastic. When you think about it, when you saw that image, right, SLAV, with the diacritical mark, a bar over the A, and you being a professor of the English language, know when you see a bar over a letter and a vowel, E, it's a hard, long sound, right? So you have slave, but there's no E on the end.
You don't need one if you put a bar over the A.
You don't need an E. And so the British spelled the word phonetically in the 16th century. That's where we get the E from, to distance the experience of bondage away from Slavic people and put it on who? African people. So they created this new spelling of the word and then retroactively put that spelling of the word back in time, where you see Aristotle was talking about the natural born slaves. And he never used the word. He was Greek, and it was translated into Latin as servant. And so we've been hoodwinked. But thanks to this woman, Mr. Bonus Fassi, I thank her for spelling slave, the way it needs to be spelled in her play, because she revealed to us how we've been tricked.
But what reveals to me how we've been tricked is the fact that Africans in Africa were free black people. When you capture people, that doesn't transfer them or transform them into slaves, however you spell it, with the diacritical mark or with the E.
Right.
The act of kidnapping people,
which is a crime,
which is a crime against humanity, does not automatically transform them into
an object,
anything other than captives.
When people always have been
captured, they are captives, and the people who capture them are captors.
Right.
They are not masters.
They are not
masters. You don't have a master-slave relationship. You have a captor-captive relationship. The captive knows that he or she is being held against his will. The captor knows that he is holding people against their wills, which means that he has to use every means possible to prevent them from being able to free themselves.
Right.
So we start very early on, with the way that the captives were placed on those ships.
Right.
You didn't put families on ships, because if you put members of the same kinship group together, they will mutiny. They will fight together for their freedom. So you combine people who don't speak the same language,
right,
who are not related to each other, who are confused about the events, and that enables you to prevent the resistance at the level that you would get the resistance.
Right.
And then you steal the children. What else do you call kidnapping children? You steal the children, the people's children. They are not going to liberate themselves and leave their children in bondage. If you've ever been, or if you ever go to Goree Island.
I've been.
Okay, and you have seen the dungeon,
Right.
which is on the lower level of a place, a residence,
Right.
where someone lives upstairs, and downstairs you have these concrete walls with these tiny spaces, unlit spaces. Men are put in this space, women are put in
Right.
this space, children are put in this space, in chains. They are unable to rescue themselves or each other. And then there's that door of no return that you see, through which they must pass in these chains to be loaded onto these ships, not loaded, not just loaded, but packed into these ships like sardines, where they must be side by side in chains with no sunshine, with no nutrition as they know nutrition, with no sanitation as they know sanitation, where they are dying in this heat, in this lack of sanitation, in this lack of
Right.
water, in the most horrendous of conditions that could ever be imposed on human beings. So some of them who had the opportunity jumped overboard. And there was a question that was raised and was, I think it was going on on various kinds of media, Twitter, tweet, Facebook, and what have you.
Kanye West.
No, this was about whether or not the Africans who jumped overboard were cowards and those who remained on board were the better ancestors because they survived.
I missed that one.
Oh well, that's that was
that one.
you got to have grandchildren. See, younger people tell you things that are going
missed
on
that
that you
one,
will
yeah.
miss. There was a debate, may still be going on, about what distinguishes the Africans who jumped overboard, something up to, what was it, 300,000, or
There's a lot of people.
who are still on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
But the point is that there was a debate going on about whether or not those who jumped overboard were cowardly and those who allowed themselves to be held captives were heroes because
I'd like to know
it was
who
they
started
who
that
survived.
debate.
Anybody can start anything and it
Right.
will get currency. So whether or not these people who survived, who were therefore our ancestors, because they were the ones who lived and not they weren't the ones who died. So we've got that kind of thing going on. But the myths and the disinformation and the misinformation that surrounds this whole question of slavery, when we were captives, we weren't slaves.
It was
We
made
were
up.
not. So now we are stuck until this dialogue gets currency. We are stuck with this whole notion that we have in some way been emancipated from slavery. Another myth, because in the first place, we weren't slaves, we were captives.
Right.
In the second place, you don't liberate anyone with a document by signing a piece of paper. And in the third place, you don't liberate anyone with a document that frees people in places where they were not captive and does not free them in places where they were. Because we had a confederacy when Honest Abe was signing this piece of paper. And the Confederacy had seceded from the Union, had its own flag, its own currency, its own military, its own government, and would not have, they were the ones who were holding the captives. They would not have even acknowledged the Emancipation Proclamation. So you weren't going to liberate any captives if in fact you could with a piece of paper. You weren't going to liberate any captives in the places where there were captives, and in the places where there weren't, it didn't apply. So you've got this, we're saddled with this nickname, this slave, and we're trying to understand our slave heritage when we didn't have a slave heritage.
There's a short video clip on the discovery of some burial grounds actually two, one in Texas, Sugar Land, Texas, and the other one in Louisiana. And I think it's one in Louisiana, something like 1,000 graves were discovered on this site where Shell Oil was going to expand their refinery or something. And they kept on saying, wow, and look at all these slave burials. Wait a minute. These are people.
These are African people.
They had names, they had families, they had legacies,
they had a language,
history,
they had a land,
they had a culture. Before this,
right?
The word slave disassociates their humanity, all of that, and makes them no more than a line or a ledger on a ledger or a spreadsheet statistic.
Absolutely.
So we have to stop using the S words. There's no such thing as slave wages because the captives were not paid.
Right.
We can't conflate or compare what someone's making playing professional sports as slave wages because the captives were never paid. That's a misnomer.
Absolutely.
We can't say trade. Trade is a transaction that happens. This was an experience. It was what I call a human harvesting enterprise where the creativity, the labor, the reproductive capacity were all harvested in service to some colonizers. That's what they were, not masters, they were colonizers, and they were corrupt. And yes, it's unsavory history that folks in this country don't want to deal with.
Well,
but it is what it is.
Well, the thing is, we have to help people understand this because they know there was a period during which we were chattel. We were treated like property.
Objects, right.
They know there was a period during which we were in bondage. That doesn't make you a slave. A captive in bondage, a captive that is sold like furniture, is not a slave. A captive is a captive is a captive. And whatever horrendous experiences are imposed upon that captive are not equivalent to slave. It's not the same. And to not recognize captivity is to say that you don't know what the experience was.
Right.
Because we're behaving or we're speaking as though these people were already slaves when they got on the ship and they were just brought to another place to continue to be slaves. And
it's the Slavic people weren't in existence until the 8th century. So you can't retroactively take this word, however you want to spell it, slave, and say, oh, well, people all over the world had slaves. They were slaves.
Well, the thing there are a couple of things about this notion that there were slaves slave trading in Africa. There are lots of books about this.
Those are fallacies.
The thing is that if one kinship group had a conflict with another kinship group, what they had were prisoners of war.
With rights, maybe limited.
They were human beings.
And they still were human beings.
They were not slaves. They were human beings who had lost, who now had a debt to pay to the ones who won. So they may have to stay and do work or whatever they had to do for a period of time, after which they go home to their families, because it is understood. This notion, this whole notion of slavery was just completely unlike taking prisoners of war and forcing them to do things because they have lost the battle, and taking people into bondage and reducing them to objects, depriving them of their peoplehood. It could not occur, because it could not occur in the African mind that a person could ever be anything other than a person. So we have to try to recognize, if we don't understand, because I don't know how you understand how you can look at me and not see a person. I don't know how you can look at me and not understand that what you see is another human being. I don't know how you get your mind to work like that. So I'm not going to understand
They have what I call humanity deficit disorder, in that, and there's been experiments done on this, that someone in this particular ethnic group sees someone not like them as other, and such that the circuitry for empathy doesn't, quote, light up when they see this other person unlike them. They don't have empathy for them. They don't see their humanity, Dr. Peace, because they're wired not to see, not to recognize. They have selective empathy for people like them. And so, as we witnessed just a few weeks ago, the separation of children from their families, you say, well, how could someone do that? Don't they see that they're people, that these are children? No, they don't see them as their children. And so they took delight in the suffering and the sorrow and the tragedy, and they did with us.
That will teach them a lesson about leaving a place that we have contributed to making uninhabitable, because
their countries.
There are places in the world where the things that we do undermine the quality of life where those people live.
That's why I call it a crime against life, not just simply a crime against humanity, because you're destroying the environments within which people live.
And people flee, and they come to the place where they think they will be safe and they will be able to live, because all they're trying to do is not die at this point.
Not die.
They're not trying to they're not coming seeking riches. All the stories, the myths that we've heard about why Europeans came to the land of the indigenous people now called American Indians. Their reasons for coming were not necessarily always honorable. You know, they said freedom
Many
of
of
speech
them were criminals.
and freedom of religion, but some of them came because they were looking for profit and dominion. And so they came.
The elites came.
They came for that purpose.
Under British law in the 15th century, slavery, S-L-A-V-I-R-E, no Y,
okay,
was punishment for crimes that was committed.
Okay.
It wasn't a crime in itself. It was punishment for a crime.
Right.
And one of the punishments was something called transport, where they would transport your butt to Australia, New Zealand, or this country to serve out your sentence.
Right. So you were deported.
You were deported.
Right.
But punishment was called transport.
Okay.
You were put on a boat and sent somewhere else, like exile, for 7, 10 years, or whatever it may have been.
Right.
So in the settler colony of Massachusetts, that was one of their first laws that they developed, was slavery as punishment for crimes. And the big punishment was being born as African. And Judge A. Leon Higginbottom documents the criminalization of our existence from laws starting in the colony of Virginia from 1681 onward. So we want to know why police persecute us? Because we're criminals in their eyes. We were born criminals. And then Judge Taney in 1857, Dred Scott decision of his citizenship.
Have no rights.
No, yes. But we're beings of an inferior order is written into federal law. And not one person has challenged that statement. So we're not human beings. According to this government, we're beings of an inferior order. So until that's removed, we're going to always have problems.
Well, the 13th Amendment is the extension of exactly what you just said.
Absolutely.
About slavery except as the punishment for crime.
Except for punishment of crimes.
So we keep finding that we have these chains that are still attached to us even though we cannot see them. You know,
Yes.
These invisible chains that are written into not just the customs and the culture, but also into the law. So that if people decide that they want to be more human in their outlook toward other human beings, that there are laws that prohibit them from taking that too far.
Exactly.
So here we are with a situation where we are aiding and abetting our own.
We're complicit in it.
That's right.
Unknowingly, unwittingly complicit.
And I think that Dr. Maya Angelou always tried to make it clear that the N word offended her. She didn't care about the explanations made by the community of artists who said
Right.
that it's a term of endearment,
right.
and you can use it and under certain circumstances, and it is restricted from use by anybody who does not fall into the category of people who can be called this and so forth. So there are a lot of people who make a lot of excuses for being able to use the term. But the term slave ought to be given the same kind of treatment. It ought not to be at least used by us. We can't prevent other people from using whatever terms they want to with regard to us, but we can avoid doing it to ourselves, and we can avoid allowing it to be done to us.
It's about dignity, recovering, declaring dignity for our ancestors. They were human beings, they were persons, and so we have to do things to help reclaim their dignity.
And our dignity as well. That's
right.
why Latifah
and
was not talking about
our
ancestors.
children's yet to be's dignity.
Right.
We have to start there by denouncing, renouncing the word slave, however you want to spell it.
We must defeat the S word. because our dignity is on the line. That's why Queen Latifah said, "Who you calling a B?"
Right.
You know, her dignity was at stake. She wasn't harking back to the ancestors.
No.
You know, she's minding her own business, and here somebody decides to call her out of her name. First of all, you have to know what your name is.
Right.
And one of the things, if you don't know what your name is, you ought to know what your name is not. And your name, if you're female, you're
Right.
not a B.
Right.
That's out of order. That's unacceptable. And if you're an African, then you are also not an N. You're not an S. You're not any. You're not a minority.
No.
Because there are all kinds of ways of calling human beings out of their names besides using profanity. You don't have to call somebody an MF.
No.
You don't have to call them an SOB. You don't have to use any so-called bad words, obscenities at all. You can sit on television and call
insult
people
someone.
obscene things all day long, and the next thing you know, somebody will be trying to be a minority. How are you going to be a minority if 9/10 of the people in the world are people of color? You can't possibly be a minority. And minority suggests not the absence of a majority, but it suggests seniority.
Right.
If you're a minority, then somebody is senior over you. Who would that be?
That's right.
If your ancestors were the ancestors of the human population on the planet, whose minor are you going to be? You cannot be the junior of somebody if you're the father of that person.
Right.
So, the thing is, it's twisted. No, don't let folks get it twisted on your watch. And I have all kinds of other people want to allow themselves to be disrespected. That's another matter. But I think
we can't do that.
I think we can't allow it for ourselves. We can't allow it for our children. If we disrespect our children, they will learn to disrespect each other. If we disrespect each other, our children will learn to disrespect each other. We can't set the example of disrespecting ourselves or allowing other people to disrespect us. It's time for Aretha to jump out there and sing all, RESPECT.
Right.
What it means to me is the dignity that you talked about.
And we have to, and we've taken the term, we've just accepted the language to define ourselves. I was in South Africa and I met with some student leaders, myself and Sister Cecile Johnson of the African Development Plan. We were there for a conference a few years ago. So we met these students and they welcomed us in traditional fashion, doing the toy dance and singing. It was humbling. And then they asked us to speak. I said, okay. And so what am I going to say to them? So I said, I want to share something with you. So I said, you never experienced apartheid. And they looked at me like I was absolutely crazy. What do you mean we never experienced apartheid? I said, is apartheid an Afrikaans word? And they said, yes. I said, does apartheid mean the regulation of the behavior, the meeting, and so forth and so on, where you can live of black South Africans? Maybe you can include coloreds in that too. They said, yes. I said, does the word apartheid capture your lived experience under those rules and regulations? The despair, the destruction, the decadence, the death, and so forth and so on. And they said, no. I said, apartheid doesn't recognize you. You need another word that captures your lived experience. Because apartheid is somebody else's term that was never intended to capture, respect, and recognize your experience. They were stunned. They were absolutely stunned. And so the same thing with this S word, with these S words, that they do not capture our experience. They are fraudulent. This is the greatest identity fraud ever, because we've accepted an identity that has nothing to do with us, nothing to do with our experience. And so we need to stop using those terms to define ourselves. And you can say enslaved. Well, Hunter, they were enslaved. I said the problem with enslaved is twofold. Number one, it comes from enclave, Latin clavis, which means under lock and key. An enclave. Slavs were in an enclave. They were prisoners of war in their own land from the Romans, the Austrians, Germans, and also Arabs. They were enclosed. They couldn't move. They were under lockdown. That's where enslave comes from enclave, enclave. So that doesn't make the humiliation go away by saying we were enslaved. Oh, well, something was done to us. I said, you're right, something was done to us, right? And it's still being done by using this language. And that was the beauty of Black Panther. Black Panther suppressed all of that foolishness and allowed us to see African people, never slaves, never colonized, never conquered, created their own economy, created their own legal structure, created their own system of labor relations, right? Because that's how it was before European and Arab interdiction. That you had thousands of civilizations, of communities all across the continent that lived autonomously and independently of any other influences because they knew they were not slaves.
You know, we had just 1 minute. I didn't want to stop you because I wanted you to keep going forever, but I didn't want you to get cut off in mid-sentence. So the important thing, I think, is to adopt the phrase, who you calling a slave? And any other nickname should be called into question in the same way. Somebody calls you out of your name, you ought to be offended, right, and you ought to demand retraction, and you ought at least not to do it yourselves.
And all this is going to be in my book, We Were Never Slaves, coming forth.
All this is going to be in your book. And I'm glad that you're writing this book, and I'm hoping to get a signed, autographed copy at the book signing.
Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to it too, so I can move on to something else.
Well, you keep moving on to something else while you're doing the book.
Right.
Right. Because you don't have a